Priests have been and still are the only class in the game with 2 healing specs, with each spec being very unique in healing styles from each other. Holy plays a little like a druid, and Dis plays like a paladin, except with bubbles. Priests were the only real healing class in Classic WoW. Back in Vanilla WoW, most classes only had 1 viable raid spec, and Holy Priests were considered the healers, but only Holy Priests. Dis was kinda terrible. 5 months into the Burning Crusade, Priests had the unique distinction of having the most popular 31-point talent in the game in the form of Shadow Form, and the least popular 31-point talent with Holy's Lightwell. This was because every Shadow Priest pretty much needed Shadow Form to be viable in anything they did, and Lightwell was garbage heal with a click requirement that no one ever actually used. Priests are largely based on bishops and clerics from typical fantasy game genre lore. In D&D particularly, clerics are versatile figures, both capable in combat and skilled in the use of divine holy magic. Clerics are powerful healers due to the large number of healing and curative magics available to them. With divinely granted abilities over life or death, they are also able to repel or control undead creatures. Whether the cleric repels or controls undeads is dependent on its alignment. It is the only class to be in every version of Dungeons & Dragons without a name change. Before Wrath of the Lich King, Priests had their own racial spells in addition to the baseline racials. Dwarf had Fear Ward, which made them the best priest for Alliance players since a lot of boss fights had fear mechanics. Undeads had Devouring Plague, which is a little overpowered and act like a powerful dot on a cooldown that healed you for all the damage it did, kinda similar to how it works today. There were other pretty neat ones, but the one I find the most interesting is the Blood Elves Consume Magic racial. Basically, they could dispel their own buffs to restore mana. If you were mind controlled by a priest from the opposite faction while under their control, you could receive messages from enemy players. Also, back when CCs lasted their full duration in PvP, it was possible to drown other players with mind control by swimming them to the bottom of a lake. In beta, Priests had a sleep spell, which was most likely reworked and incorporated as the Druid's hibernate ability. Also, the disc tree for Disc and Vanilla had a talent to increase wand damage. It's not that wands did a lot of damage back then either, it's just Disc was really bad. They even had a spell that increased their attack power, despite not having any physical attacks. Most power word spells that Priests have today, like Power Word Shield and Fort, were called Holy Word, but later changed because Paladins had enough holy stuff in their names and they wanted to make Priests different from Pallies. But then once Chakra stances were brought into the game, they got their Holy Word abilities again, so For a short while at the beginning of Cataclysm, when Disc Priests were given the spell Powerword Barrier for the first time, it was so OP that despite being the worst healers by a country mile, every raid stacked as many as they could because they could straight up ignore raid mechanics by stacking barriers during certain phases. Even after the spell was nerfed, it was still the best raid cooldown in the game for quite some time, and is still going strong today. Vanilla WoW, most classes only had 1 viable spec for raiding. Priests were no exception to the rule, and most went Holy to be the healer. But PvP was a different story altogether for Shadow Priests. You see, there were a lot of things going well for Shadow Priests in PvP back then. Fears were kinda OP, and took a ton of damage to break before a well-deserved nerf, and Priests had the only instant cast Fear in the game at the time. Plus, PvP trinkets only remove certain types of CC instead of everything like they do today. There were 3 reliable ways to break Fear, but you had to be an undead warrior with blacksmithing specialization to get them all. But it wasn't just Fear. They had heals and offensive and defensive dispels, something that still sets them apart in PvP to this day. They also had a talent called Blackout that had a 10% chance every time you did shadow damage to stun the target for 3 seconds. With Shadow Word Pain and spamming Mind Flay, you could get procs pretty often. And this 3-second stun had no DRs for a while in Classic, meaning it could proc over and over for the full 3 seconds every time. In addition to that, despite Mind Flay having one of the worst spell power coefficients in the game, it hit hard, as did Shadow Word Pain. And to top it all off, a fully geared Shadow Priest in Warlord's gear had nearly as much health as a fully geared warrior. And that's it for this video. If you have any interesting facts about priests, go ahead and leave them in a comment and I'll totally steal those ideas for another video. Also, if you know any interesting things similar to this video, but for the other 10 classes, go ahead and leave it in a comment. I do plan on making one of these for every class.